Tonight we begin with a story of power, politics, and the law, a collision of ambition and accountability at the heart of American democracy. In Washington, the stakes are never just about one man or one case. They ripple outward, touching the very core of how justice and politics intertwine. Behind closed doors, Congress demanded answers from Jack Smith, the Justice Department's special counsel who investigated President Donald Trump. The halls of power echoed with questions, suspicion, and the weight of history. Smith's work led to two historic indictments, one for Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and another for mishandling classified documents. These cases were unprecedented, targeting a former president and raising questions about the limits of executive power. But after Trump's 2024 election victory, the Justice Department dropped both cases. The sudden reversal sent shockwaves through the legal and political worlds, leaving many to wonder if justice had been served or subverted. The investigations ended, but the new Republican House majority wanted more. They saw unfinished business and a chance to reshape the narrative for their own political future. They subpoenaed Jack Smith, demanding he explain why the investigations began and every decision he made. The move was bold, signaling a new era of congressional oversight and confrontation. This was no friendly invitation. It was a command to account for his actions against the now sitting president. The tone was adversarial, the stakes personal and political. On one side, a prosecutor who pursued a former president believing in the rule of law above all else. Smith's reputation for independence and tenacity was now on trial. On the other, Trump's allies, convinced the cases were political attacks. They rallied supporters, framing the investigations as partisan warfare rather than a quest for justice. They saw Smith as a partisan, not an independent prosecutor. Every answer he gave would be scrutinized, every motive questioned. The hearing was set for December 17, 2025, a date that would become a flashpoint in the ongoing battle over truth and power in America. Jack Smith, now a private citizen, entered Congress as a compelled witness. The weight of his decisions, and the nation's expectations, rested on his shoulders. The stakes were high. Was this accountability for Smith, or for Trump, or was it something larger, a test of the system itself? Republicans wanted to put Smith's investigation on trial, hoping to expose what they saw as overreach and bias. For them, this was about restoring trust in their vision of justice. Smith saw it as a final chance to lay out the facts about Trump's conduct. He was determined to defend his work and the principles that guided it before the nation. The confrontation was about more than legal arguments. It was about who would control the story, and how history would remember this moment. The hearing was a moment of reckoning, but for whom? For Smith, for Trump, or for the institutions that define American democracy? Was it a search for truth, or a political spectacle? The line between the two had never seemed so thin, or so important. The nation watched, waiting to see who would be held to account. In living rooms and offices, Americans debated what justice should look like in a divided era. In that room, history was being written, by those with the most to gain, and, perhaps the most to lose. Every word, every gesture, would echo far beyond the chamber's walls. The question, whose version would endure? In the end, the answer would shape not just the legacy of one investigation, but the future of American democracy itself. You might expect a hearing of this magnitude to be broadcast live, with every word and gesture scrutinized by the public and the press. But instead, the House Judiciary Committee made a deliberate choice for secrecy, shutting out cameras and locking the doors to outside observers. They turned down Jack Smith's offer to testify in an open forum, insisting that the session remain behind closed doors, away from the public eye. The official explanation was the presence of sensitive material and the need for lawmakers to speak candidly without fear of public backlash or political theater. Yet critics quickly pointed out that secrecy also allowed committee members to control the narrative, leaking only what suited their agenda and keeping inconvenient truths hidden. The American public would be left with only carefully crafted summaries and selective leaks, never the full, unfiltered exchange. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation as lawmakers prepared to question Smith. Smith faced a panel of lawmakers, many of whom had spent the past year publicly questioning his motives and the legitimacy of his investigation. He arrived with a meticulously prepared opening statement, aware that this might be his only direct message to the historical record, and perhaps his only chance to set the record straight. Smith's goal was to correct misinformation and defend the integrity of his investigation, even if the public would never see or hear his words firsthand. For millions of Americans, the result was a version of history filtered through the perspectives of those with the most at stake, leaving many to wonder what was left unsaid. The battle became as much about shaping the story as about uncovering the facts, with both sides eager to influence public perception. By holding the hearing in private, the committee ensured it would shape the first draft of history, deciding what details would be revealed and what would remain hidden. In the end, truth became a contest of press releases and official statements rather than a transparent, public reckoning. The real story of what happened in that room, the questions asked, the answers given, may never be fully known to the public. In the end, the secrecy itself became a central part of the controversy, fueling debate and suspicion that may linger for years to come. At the heart of Smith's testimony was a clear message: he alone made the decisions. He told Congress, "The decision to bring charges against President Trump was mine." Smith rejected claims he was acting on political orders, insisting the evidence compelled him to act. He argued Trump's own actions created the legal case. Smith said he'd make the same decision again, regardless of party. He portrayed himself as a nonpartisan prosecutor, guided by facts and law. Critics didn't accept this, but Smith stood firm. He wasn't there to apologize, he was there to defend the process. "My decisions were mine alone," he repeated, pushing back against the idea he was a political pawn. Smith followed the evidence, even when it led to the most powerful man in the country. His defense was absolute. One of Smith's major investigations focused on the events of January 6th and the sweeping efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. The stakes were high, and the nation watched as the investigation unfolded, revealing the depth of the crisis facing American democracy. Smith told Congress his team had gathered proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump was part of a criminal scheme. The evidence was not just circumstantial, it was detailed, documented, and meticulously compiled over months of work. He described a coordinated plan to use false claims of fraud, pressure state and federal officials, and ultimately obstruct the certification of the election's results. The scheme was complex, involving multiple actors and a web of misleading narratives. The evidence, Smith emphasized, came from Trump's own inner circle, Republicans who had worked closely with him, not political opponents or outside critics. These were people who had witnessed the events firsthand. The case was ultimately dropped after Trump's victory, but Smith used his testimony to ensure the findings were put on the official record, refusing to let the truth be buried or forgotten. He wanted history to know, without any doubt, that the evidence pointed to a deliberate, organized conspiracy to subvert the foundations of American democracy. This was his only chance to present the case, to speak directly to the nation and its leaders, and to make sure the truth was heard. Smith made sure Congress heard every detail, even if there would never be a trial or a formal verdict in court. He wanted the facts to be undeniable. The official record now included his team's conclusion: a former president had tried to hold on to power by illegal means, challenging the very core of the nation's laws. In the end, it would be history, not a jury, that would judge these actions and their impact on American democracy. The second case involved Trump's handling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Smith told Congress the evidence was clear. Trump intentionally kept sensitive national defense documents after leaving office. More serious, Smith said, was the charge of obstruction. Trump allegedly directed efforts to hide documents from investigators and his own lawyers. Witnesses described actions taken at Trump's direction to conceal records. Smith argued this was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate cover-up. The case was dismissed before trial, and the Justice Department dropped the appeal after the election. Smith's testimony was his last chance to argue the case's merits. He insisted this was a clear-cut violation of the law. The evidence, he said, pointed to a former president breaking the law and trying to cover it up. The story would now be judged by history, not the courts. Throughout the investigations, Smith was accused of being a partisan out to damage Trump. In the hearing, Smith firmly denied any political motive. He said his decisions had nothing to do with Trump's candidacy or party. The timing of indictments, Smith insisted, was driven by evidence, not the election. Committee members pushed back, citing subpoenas for Republican lawmakers' records. Smith responded, "Investigators follow evidence, regardless of political status." He couldn't discuss specifics, but said no one is above the law. For Smith, facts, not politics, guided his work. For his critics, the investigation itself was political. The divide was unbridgeable. Smith couldn't answer every question. Grand jury secrecy tied his hands. By law, details about grand jury proceedings are confidential to protect reputations and encourage candor. When asked about specific witnesses or evidence, Smith had to decline. The committee knew the rules, but pressed anyway, implying evasion. Smith explained he was following the law, not hiding facts. He could discuss conclusions, but not the protected details. This frustrated lawmakers and created a sense of opacity. The legal wall meant some answers would never be public. Even Smith's critics knew the limits, but used the silence to their advantage. The hearing was shaped as much by what couldn't be said, as by what was revealed. The wall of secrecy remained. The hearing was a clash of two narratives. Smith's story, a nonpartisan investigation, following evidence to its conclusion, upholding the rule of law. He argued ignoring the evidence would mean some people are above the law. The committee's story, a weaponized justice system, targeting Trump for political reasons. They saw the indictments as election interference, not justice. Each side used the hearing to reinforce their version. The dropped cases became proof for Trump's allies that the charges were weak. The gulf between the two stories was unbridgeable. The hearing settled nothing, it only deepened the divide. After Trump's 2024 victory, the Justice Department dropped both federal cases against him. For Trump's allies, this was vindication, a political witch hunt defeated. They called Smith to testify, not to relitigate, but to claim victory and put him on the defensive. For Smith, it was his last chance to put his side on the record. With no trial, his testimony was the only public account of his team's work. He used it to defend his decisions, his evidence, and his team's integrity. Smith stood by his actions, denying any political bias, and said he'd do it all again. He left the hearing, his role complete. The cases are closed, but the debate rages on. The transcript now sits in Congress's archives, a final account from the special counsel who charged a president. The verdict belongs to history and the American people. The story is far from over.